There is something a narcissist will never openly admit. They hide it behind charm, anger, silence, and emotional performances that only show up when it benefits them. It is not your anger that unsettles them, not your crying, and not even your decision to leave. They have been through all of that before and learned how to survive it. What truly destabilizes them is the moment you stop reacting the way they expect. When you begin to see them clearly, when your attention shifts from emotional response to calm observation, something inside their control system collapses. The image they carefully built no longer works. In that moment, the dynamic changes completely because the energy they feed on disappears. And what you begin to notice is not your weakness, but the fact that their power was always dependent on your reaction. Before going deeper, do something for yourself. If you have ever been manipulated, gaslit, or emotionally drained by someone who claimed to love you, subscribe to Narcissist Insight right now, not for anyone else, but for your clarity. What you are about to understand can change how you see every toxic relationship you have lived through. Narcissists do not operate from love or connection. They operate from control because control is what keeps their inner emptiness quiet. To gain it, they study you, your fears, your needs, your emotional wounds, and your desire to be understood. Then they present themselves as the answer you were missing. That is why the beginning feels intense and unreal. It is not true intimacy, it is information gathering, a mapping of your emotional world to influence you. When you begin to heal, entire system stops working. When a narcissist senses that their control over you is slipping, their behavior shifts in unpredictable ways. They do not become reflective or self-aware. Instead, they enter a state of hidden panic disguised as dominance. One moment they may turn cold and distant, and the next they may become overly sweet or attentive in a way that feels forced. They might withdraw without explanation, then suddenly reappear as if nothing happened. They create conflict out of small things, reopen old emotional wounds, or twist past events to confuse your perception of reality. The goal is always the same, to provoke a reaction from you, because your reaction is what keeps their sense of control alive. Without it, their influence weakens, and their identity feels unstable. To them, silence and emotional neutrality from you is more threatening than any argument. One of the first clear signs that control is slipping is sudden, irrational rage. It does not follow logic or proportion. Something small, like your tone of voice, a delayed response, a boundary you set, or a moment where you do not react with amusement, can trigger an intense emotional explosion. But that rage is never about the surface issue. It is about what they feel they are losing from you, your attention, your compliance, your emotional energy. When charm no longer works, they shift into intimidation. When intimidation fails, they move toward emotional destruction. In their mind, escalation is a strategy. They believe that if softer methods fail to pull you back into reaction, stronger and harsher behavior will succeed. What you are witnessing is not random anger. It is a desperate attempt to regain control over a connection that is slipping away. When control begins to weaken, another common response is sudden withdrawal. The narcissist may go silent, give you the cold shoulder, disappear without explanation, or sit beside you with an empty, distant stare that feels emotionally absent. To someone unaware of these dynamics, it may look like indifference or emotional detachment, but internally it is a form of punishment. The purpose is to make you feel unseen, unwanted, and emotionally unstable enough to chase them. They are testing whether your old emotional wounds, fear of abandonment, rejection, or not being enough, will react the way they expect. If you stay grounded and do not pursue them, something significant shifts. Your silence shows them that their absence does not break you. And that realization becomes deeply unsettling for them because it reveals they no longer have access to your emotional dependency. Another manipulative stage appears when blame shifting becomes extreme and almost theatrical. Suddenly, every issue in the relationship is rewritten as your fault. Their harsh words are framed as reactions to your behavior. Their lies are justified by your supposed lack of trust. Even their betrayal is shifted onto you because you did not love or understand them correctly. This is not a conversation or a conflict. It is a psychological operation designed to reshape your perception of reality. The goal is to reinstall guilt, shame, and self-doubt so you begin questioning yourself instead of them. Because when you are busy doubting your own mind, you are easier to control. But when that influence fades, something powerful happens. You start to see. And without imposed guilt running in the background, you become unreachable, emotionally free, and no longer easy to break. When freedom appears in someone they once controlled, it becomes intolerable for the narcissist to accept peace in that person's life. The fourth sign is the smear campaign. When internal manipulation no longer works, they shift outward. They begin rewriting your identity to others, speaking to friends, family, coworkers, sometimes even children, painting you as unstable, selfish, ungrateful, or confused. The narrative is reshaped so convincingly that people who once trusted you start doubting what they know. But this is not about truth. It is about rebuilding psychological control through social pressure. If they cannot control your mind directly, they try to control how the world sees you, hoping it pulls you back into confusion. If this is reaching you, subscribe to Narcissist Insight and comment awake so I know you are following, because what comes next exposes the final layer of this pattern. What most people fail to understand is that emotional independence is what threatens a narcissist more than anything else. Not your departure, not your anger, not your success, but the moment you no longer rely on their validation to feel whole. In that moment, the connection they were feeding from collapses. Without emotional dependency, their influence loses its anchor, and that is when their behavior becomes more intense rather than calm. Boundaries play a central role here because boundaries are not barriers, they are mirrors. And the narcissist cannot tolerate a reflection that shows you exist beyond their control. Every boundary, even the quietest one, reveals separation. It shows them you are not an extension of them, but a fully formed self. That realization triggers discomfort that they often translate into hostility, because deep down, they experience your independence as rejection, exposure, and loss of control all at once. Once you understand this dynamic, every reaction begins to make a different kind of sense. The rage is not strength, but panic losing containment. The silence is not superiority, but punishment rooted in fear. The blame shifting is not confidence, but desperation to avoid inner collapse. Even the smear campaign becomes a signal that control is slipping beyond repair. What once appeared as power starts to reveal itself as fragility wrapped in performance. Beneath it all is fear, not occasional, but constant, the fear of being exposed as empty, ordinary, or unworthy of admiration. And because that fear cannot be held internally, it is projected outward onto whoever is closest. For years, that role was placed on you. But the moment you stop carrying it, the illusion breaks. And once you see the pattern clearly, you cannot return to confusion again, because awareness itself becomes the end of their control. But here is where it becomes even deeper. A narcissist's greatest fear is not that you leave, it is that you change into someone they no longer recognize. Because the version of you they were attached to was never your full self. It was the version that doubted, the version that over-explained, apologized quickly, stayed too long, and gave without limits. That version was predictable and easy to influence. But when you start healing, when you begin to speak clearly, move calmly, set boundaries without guilt, and choose peace over emotional chaos, you stop being familiar to them, and unfamiliar people cannot be controlled using old emotional triggers. The past wounds they once relied on no longer open the same way. The language they used to speak to your emotions no longer works, because you are no longer that same emotional version of yourself. This is why healing terrifies them more than anything else. Not revenge, not exposure, not even you walking away. Healing. Because everything else can be rewritten in their mind as a story that still gives them control. But a healed version of you cannot be rewritten or reduced. A healed person does not chase, does not explain endlessly, does not react on demand. They simply exist with clarity and self-respect. And self-respect is something they cannot manipulate because it removes the emotional entry points they used to rely on. Guilt no longer lands. Flattery loses effect. Fear stops working. You begin trusting your own perception more than their version of events, and that alone ends their influence. You were never weak for responding the way you did. You were open, trusting, and emotionally honest in a way they exploited. Not because you lacked value, but because you had depth they could not create themselves. Once you see this clearly, everything starts to shift. Their rage is no longer power, it is panic. Their silence is not control, it is frustration. Their blame shifting and sudden narratives are not truth, but attempts to regain influence over a mind that is no longer available. Even their smear campaigns and sudden changes in behavior become signs of loss, not strength. What you once experienced as confusion begins to look like exposure. And in that clarity, something important happens. You stop trying to win arguments or prove your worth to someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. You start choosing yourself consistently, quietly, without needing permission. And in that space, freedom becomes real. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady and irreversible. What usually gets missed in these dynamics is that the power shift doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly, in small internal decisions that no one else sees. At first, it is just hesitation before replying. Then it becomes pausing before explaining yourself. Then it becomes not explaining at all when something is clearly unreasonable. From the outside, nothing looks dramatic, but internally, something fundamental is changing. You stop treating their reactions as a measure of your reality. That alone removes a huge part of their influence, because their control was never physical, it was interpretive. They depended on you doubting your own interpretation of events. As that doubt weakens, you start noticing something else too. The same behaviors that once felt confusing or overwhelming begin to feel predictable. Not because they changed, but because your perception did. The emotional fog clears. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated incidents. You recognize that sudden warmth after distance is not randomness, it is regulation. You understand that coldness after closeness is not personality, it is strategy. And once behavior becomes predictable, it stops feeling powerful. It becomes observable instead of immersive. That shift alone reduces emotional entanglement more than any confrontation ever could. Another layer people often don't talk about is how much internal permission is required to stay in a healed state. Because even after clarity begins, old emotional conditioning tries to pull you back into familiar roles. The urge to explain yourself again, the urge to fix misunderstandings, the urge to make them see. These urges are not signs of weakness. They are echoes of attachment patterns that once kept you emotionally invested. But every time you don't act on them, something rewires. You begin to learn that peace does not require participation in chaos. And what becomes most striking over time is how differently silence feels. Earlier, silence from them felt like punishment, like danger, like emotional withdrawal you had to repair. But later, silence becomes neutral. It stops demanding action from you. It stops defining your worth. That is one of the clearest indicators that emotional control has loosened, when absence no longer triggers internal collapse. At that point, the dynamic changes without any announcement. You are no longer trying to decode them because you are no longer centered around them. Your emotional energy stops orbiting their behavior. And when that orbit breaks, the entire system they relied on quietly dissolves. Not because they lost something external, but because you stopped supplying the internal reaction that kept the cycle alive. And what replaces it is not anger or revenge. It is distance in the most natural sense. You simply become less reachable through emotional hooks. Things that once pulled you in no longer find entry points. Conversations that once spiraled now end early. Situations that once required emotional recovery now barely register. That is what real detachment looks like. Not coldness, but clarity without emotional entanglement. Over time, you realize something even more important. You were never learning how to defeat someone else. You were learning how to stop abandoning yourself in real time. What also becomes clearer with time is that narcissistic dynamics don't actually depend on extraordinary manipulation techniques as much as they depend on emotional access. If someone can consistently access your attention, your self-doubt, your desire to explain yourself, or your need to restore harmony, they don't need advanced strategies. The system runs itself. That is why these patterns feel so consuming. They are built on normal human traits like empathy, loyalty, and emotional investment being redirected against the person who has them. When that access starts closing, the relationship feels unstable from both sides, but for very different reasons. For you, it is because things start making sense and you no longer feel as emotionally compelled to fix every disruption. For them, it is because the usual emotional responses are no longer guaranteed, and unpredictability in a system they relied on feels like loss of control. That is often when escalation appears, not because the situation is more intense, but because the feedback loop is weakening. Something subtle also happens in your thinking during this stage. You begin to separate intent from impact. Earlier, you might have focused heavily on trying to understand why they did something, hoping that understanding would reduce the emotional effect. But later, you start focusing more on what something does to you rather than why it was done. That shift is important because it moves you out of analysis and into awareness. You stop getting stuck in explanations that keep you emotionally tied. Another change is how your internal boundaries begin to form without effort. At first, boundaries feel like something you have to actively enforce, almost like a rule you are trying to remember under stress. But over time, they become automatic responses. You don't negotiate certain behaviors anymore, not because you are trying to make a statement, but because your system simply doesn't engage with them the same way. There is less emotional debate inside you before you say no or before you step back. What is often misunderstood is that narcissistic behavior tends to escalate when it stops producing results, not when it is discovered. Discovery alone doesn't end the cycle. Disengagement does. A person can understand everything intellectually and still remain emotionally hooked. That is why clarity, without behavioral change, often keeps people stuck. The real shift happens when understanding starts translating into different choices, even small ones. And as those choices accumulate, something important becomes visible. The dynamic was never stable in the first place. It only felt stable because you were adapting continuously. Once you stop over-adapting, the imbalance shows itself clearly. What looked like a powerful personality begins to look like a pattern that requires constant participation from others to function. At that point, the experience stops being about them as a central figure in your emotional world. They become one part of a larger learning process about your own limits, your own instincts, and your own ability to recognize when something is asking you to disappear in order to continue. Another part that becomes clearer later is how much of the confusion was maintained through inconsistency rather than intensity. It was never just the good moments or the bad moments on their own. It was the rapid switching between them that kept your nervous system engaged. When someone alternates between closeness and distance without explanation, your mind naturally starts trying to solve the pattern because uncertainty is uncomfortable. That searching for stability is exactly what keeps emotional attachment active, even when the relationship is harmful. As you start stepping out of that cycle, you notice something unusual. The emotional highs stop feeling as meaningful, and the emotional lows stop feeling as catastrophic. It is not that you become numb, but that your system stops overreacting to inconsistency. What used to feel like urgency starts feeling like noise, and when urgency disappears, so does a major source of control. You also begin to see how much energy was previously spent maintaining emotional balance for two people. Not just reacting, but anticipating, thinking ahead about what might trigger a reaction, adjusting your tone, softening your words, timing your responses. This kind of constant self-monitoring creates the illusion of effort from both sides, but in reality, it is mostly one person adapting to the emotional volatility of the other. When that adaptation stops, the imbalance becomes visible very quickly. At the same time, your self-concept begins to stabilize. Earlier, your sense of who you were might have been influenced by how you were treated in the moment, confident when things were good, doubtful when things shifted. Over time, that external feedback loses authority. You start building an internal reference point that is less dependent on how someone else is behaving toward you. That internal stability is what actually breaks the cycle, because manipulation loses effectiveness when it cannot redefine your self-image in real time. Another shift happens in how you interpret conflict. Instead of seeing conflict as something that needs to be resolved immediately to restore peace, you start seeing it as information. Not every disagreement requires repair, and not every emotional reaction requires engagement. Some things are simply signals about incompatibility or control dynamics. That perspective alone reduces the emotional urgency that previously kept you entangled. And eventually, something very simple but profound happens. You stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional depth. What once felt like strong connection begins to look more like activation of old wounds. Real connection starts to feel calmer, more consistent, and less demanding. It doesn't require you to shrink or expand depending on someone's mood. At that stage, the most important realization is not about them anymore. It is about how easily your attention, empathy, and patience were once redirected away from yourself. And once you see that clearly, the goal is no longer to decode the past, but to make sure your future attention always returns to you first. Another layer that becomes obvious over time is how much of the bond was maintained through intermittent reinforcement. In simple terms, it was the unpredictability of affection that kept you emotionally engaged. When kindness is consistent, the nervous system relaxes. But when kindness appears randomly after withdrawal or conflict, the brain becomes more alert, more focused, and more invested in trying to earn it again. That cycle can feel like deep attachment, but it is really the mind trying to restore predictability. As that pattern fades, something changes in how you respond internally. You stop scanning for shifts in tone. You stop reading between lines that were never meant to be stable in the first place. Conversations lose their hidden tension because you are no longer interpreting every interaction as a potential emotional test. That reduction in hypervigilance is one of the clearest signs that the system is loosening its grip. Another important shift is how you begin to relate to apologies, explanations, and emotional displays. Earlier, these might have felt meaningful, even corrective, but with distance and clarity, you start noticing a difference between emotional expression and emotional accountability. Expression can be intense, persuasive, even overwhelming. But accountability is consistent behavior over time. When you stop confusing the two, manipulation loses one of its strongest entry points. You also begin to recognize how often you were placed in a role of emotional stabilizer, not just reacting to their emotions, but regulating them, calming things down, explaining misunderstandings, absorbing tension to prevent escalation. This creates a subtle imbalance where one person is constantly adjusting while the other sets the emotional pace. When you step out of that role, the instability that was always present becomes visible instead of managed. At some point, your attention starts shifting back toward your own internal state more naturally. Instead of constantly analyzing what they meant, you begin noticing what you feel without immediately attaching it to them. That separation is crucial because it restores ownership of your emotional experience. Your feelings stop being responses to them and start becoming information about you. And eventually, a quiet realization settles in. The confusion was never proof of complexity, it was proof of inconsistency. What once felt like depth was often just unpredictability experienced through emotional investment. When that investment reduces, the depth often dissolves into patterns that are far simpler than they first appeared. At that point, the focus shifts again. Not toward understanding them better, but toward understanding how easily your attention can be pulled away from your own center when emotional intensity is used as a substitute for real stability. Another realization that often comes later is that the strongest control was never coming from what was said during conflict, but from what your mind started doing afterward. The replaying, the overthinking, the attempts to reinterpret every word to find a version that makes everything make sense. That mental loop creates the illusion that resolution is always just one more explanation away. But in reality, it keeps you emotionally connected long after the interaction has ended. As that loop weakens, you start noticing something important. Not every unanswered question needs closure from the other person. Some things were never meant to be resolved in conversation because the lack of clarity was part of the pattern itself. When you stop forcing clarity where none is offered, your mind becomes quieter. And in that quiet, emotional dependence loses a major channel of reinforcement. You also begin to understand how much emotional responsibility you are carrying without realizing it. Not just your own emotions, but the emotional climate of the relationship. You were often the one adjusting tone, softening tension, preventing escalation, or repairing distance. That role creates a subtle identity shift where your sense of stability becomes tied to managing someone else's instability. When you step out of that role, the imbalance becomes undeniable, not because anything new is happening, but because you are no longer compensating for it. Another shift happens in how you interpret urgency. Earlier, urgency felt like importance. If something felt emotionally intense, it felt like it required immediate response, immediate fixing, immediate explanation. But later, you begin to see that urgency can also be a tool that keeps you from thinking clearly. Not everything that feels pressing is actually significant. Sometimes urgency is just emotional pressure designed to override reflection. As this awareness grows, your reactions begin to slow down naturally. You don't respond less because you are trying to play a role, but because your system is no longer being pulled into automatic reactions. There is space between stimulus and response again, and in that space, choice returns. What also becomes clearer is that the relationship dynamic was never truly about understanding each other. It was about one person adapting continuously while the other remained the emotional reference point. Once adaptation stops, the structure doesn't break. It simply reveals that it was never balanced to begin with. And eventually, your attention shifts in a way that is hard to describe, but easy to feel. You stop treating emotional intensity as meaningful direction. You stop assuming that confusion must be solved by more engagement. And you start recognizing that peace is not something you negotiate. It is something you return to when you stop abandoning yourself in emotionally charged moments. In the end, what this entire pattern really reveals is not just how manipulation works, but how emotional dependence is formed and maintained through repetition, uncertainty, and self-abandonment. It was never only about one person's behavior. It was about how your attention, empathy, and need for understanding were gradually redirected away from yourself and toward decoding someone who was never emotionally consistent to begin with. When you step back far enough, the picture becomes much simpler than it ever felt in the middle of it. The confusion was not depth. The intensity was not connection. The inconsistency was not complexity. It was a system that stayed alive through your participation in trying to make sense of something that was never stable enough to fully make sense of. And the most important shift is not realizing who they are, but realizing what changed in you. You stopped reacting automatically. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped treating emotional disruption as something you are responsible for fixing. Slowly, your attention returned to where it should have been all along, your own thoughts, your own boundaries, your own peace. At that point, the dynamic loses its foundation, not because you defeated someone, but because you withdrew the internal energy that kept the cycle active. What once felt like emotional chaos starts to look like predictable patterns that only function when they are constantly engaged. Without engagement, they fade into irrelevance. And what remains is clarity. Not loud clarity, not emotional clarity, but quiet clarity, the kind that doesn't need validation from anyone else to feel true. You begin to understand that healing was never about becoming stronger than someone else. It was about becoming steady within yourself again. And once that steadiness returns, you stop looking at the past as something that defines you. You see it as something that taught you where you stopped choosing yourself, and more importantly, where you will never stop again.